My brother was the one everyone talked about at dinner, every single night. Without fail, my father would set his fork down, look across the table at my brother with something close to reverence, and say, "That boy is going somewhere." My brother would smile that easy. Practice smile. He'd been perfecting since he was 12, and my mother would quietly pass the breadbasket and say nothing. I would sit there, cutting my food into smaller and smaller pieces, and think about the acceptance letter I had folded inside my textbook upstairs. I never told them that night. I waited 3 more days. My brother's name is Derek. He is 4 years older than me, 6 feet tall, and has my father's jaw and my father's confidence and my father's absolute certainty that the world was built with him in mind. He joined the Army National Guard at 22. Did 1 8-month deployment to Kuwait. Came home with a tan and a handful of stories he told at every family gathering for the next 3 years. My father treated it like Derek had personally ended a war. I am not Derek. My name is not important yet. What matters is that I was the quiet one. The one who read too much, stayed up too late, kept lists in a spiral notebook that I never showed anyone. Lists of things I wanted to understand. Lists of questions about how things worked, machines, people, systems under pressure. My high school counselor once told me I had an unusual mind. My father once told me I thought too hard about things that didn't matter. My brother once laughed and said I'd probably end up teaching somewhere. None of them knew I'd applied to West Point. I applied in the fall of my senior year. Alone. In the library computer lab after school. I told my mother first, because she was the only one I trusted with something fragile. She looked at me for a long moment across the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug, and then she said very quietly, "I think you can do it." That was all. 4 words. But she said them like she meant every syllable. And I held on to that for months. The appointment came through in March. Congressional nomination. Full acceptance. I read the letter 4 times, standing at the mailbox in the cold. When I told my father, he looked up from the television, looked back at the screen, and said, "West Point. Who?" Then he asked Derek if he wanted more coffee. My brother at least had the decency to look surprised. "West Point," he said. "You. No offense. But you sure about that?" I told him I was sure. He shook his head the way people do when they're certain you're about to make a mistake. "It's not like college," he said. "It's physical. It's intense. It's not just reading and lists and whatever it is you do." I said I understood. He looked at me the way my father always looked at me, like he was waiting for me to realize something about myself that they had already figured out long ago. Like the conclusion was already written, and I just hadn't read it yet. I left for West Point that July. My mother hugged me in the driveway for a long time and didn't say anything. My father shook my hand. Derek waved from the porch. I didn't look back. The first 6 weeks at West Point nearly broke me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Not the physical part I had trained for 8 months. Quietly. Methodically. The way I did everything. I had spreadsheets. I had a pacing plan. I had mapped out every physical requirement and built a schedule backward from the standard I needed to meet. What I hadn't fully prepared for was the noise, the constant, relentless, deliberate noise upperclassmen in your face at 5 a.m. Your name being called wrong on purpose? Your every hesitation cataloged and announced. They weren't trying to break your body. They were trying to find out what you did when everything external was chaos. They wanted to see what you reached for when the noise got loud enough. I reached for my lists. Not physical lists anymore. Mental ons. In the middle of a 12-mile ruck march with 40 pounds on my back and someone screaming cadence I couldn't quite hear, I would run through what I knew. Terrain. Weather. The names of the people in front of me. What they'd eaten. Who was favoring their left ankle. I couldn't stop the noise, but I could build a structure inside it. And once I had that structure, I could move through almost anything. My roommate that first year was a woman named Carla. She was from Georgia, fast as a whip, and she had absolutely no patience for self-pity. The first time I stayed up until 2 a.m., going over maps for a land navigation exercise. She rolled over in her bunk and said, "You know, most people just try to memorize the checkpoints, right?" I told her I wasn't most people. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "No. I'm starting to see that." She said it like it was a compliment. It was the first one I'd gotten since I arrived. I called home every 2 weeks. My mother asked careful questions. My father asked once if I was keeping up and then handed the phone to Derek, who wanted to know if West Point was as hard as the real army. I told him it was a different kind of hard. He made a sound in his throat that meant he didn't think so. By the end of my second year, my tactical performance evaluations were in the top 8% of my class. I didn't announce this. I wrote it in my notebook and kept going. What I was good at was not what people expected. I wasn't the loudest voice in the planning room. I wasn't the one who stood up first with a solution. I was the one who sat in the back and listened to every proposed solution, and then, very quietly, I pointed out the variable everyone else had missed. The one exit route that would flood in rain. The communication gap between 2 units that would leave a flank exposed for 6 minutes. Small things. Invisible things. The kind of things that only mattered when everything went wrong, and things always went wrong. By the time I was commissioned as a second lieutenant, I had a reputation among my cohort. Not a flashy one. Not the kind that got you bought drinks at the bar near campus. But Carla, who had become the closest thing I had to a best friend, once told me that when they needed someone to solve a problem that nobody could solve, my name came up. Every time I went home for Christmas of my commissioning year, my mother had made the house warm and the table full, the way she always did when she was trying to create the conditions for peace. My father sat at the head of the table. Derek sat at his right hand, the way he always had. I sat across from my mother and watched her watch both of them. Derek was in a good mood. He'd recently been promoted to staff sergeant, and my father had already toasted it twice. Derek leaned back in his chair with the comfort of a man who had never once been unsure of his welcome. And he looked at me across the cranberry sauce and said, "So what's next for you? Some desk assignment somewhere?" I told him I'd been assigned to a unit, that I'd be deploying. He tilted his head. "What unit?" I said it was a support and advisory role, attached to a special operations element. He made that sound again. "Advisory," he repeated. "So you're not the one doing the actual work." "Right. You're just there to help the guys who are." My mother's fork went very still on her plate. I told him that was one way to look at it. He laughed. It was an easy laugh. The kind that wasn't meant to be cruel, and was anyway. "I'm just saying. They're not going to put some girl, a woman. Whatever, they're not putting you on the front line of anything serious. No offense." My father didn't disagree. He reached for his glass instead. My mother looked at me. Just looked at me. Directly. And her expression said something that she never said out loud. It said, "I know. And I'm sorry. And I see you anyway." I kept eating. I deployed 9 months later to a region I am not going to name in detail. What I can tell you is that it was not a desk. What I can tell you is that the special operations element I was attached to had been operating in that region for 8 months before I arrived. And they had a problem they hadn't been able to solve. Not a tactical problem. A pattern problem. They were losing people in engagements that should have been manageable. Not because they lacked skill or bravery, they had both in extraordinary supply. They were losing people because something in the intelligence process upstream was consistently giving them a corrupted picture of the terrain. And nobody had been able to identify where the corruption was happening. I identified it in 11 days. I want to be clear about something. I am not telling you this to sound exceptional. I am telling you this because what I did was not dramatic. I sat in a room for 11 days with 5 years of incident reports, cross-referenced them against communication logs and weather patterns and personnel rotations, and found the gap. It was a 17-minute window in the reporting cycle, recurring every 4 to 6 days, during which the picture they were receiving was 6 hours old instead of current. 6 hours is an eternity in a fluid environment. 6 hours is the difference between accurate and catastrophic. I wrote a 4-page report and handed it to the unit commander. He read it, looked up at me, and said, "How long have you been in theater?" I told him, 11 days. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Sit down." We fixed the gap. The next 3 months went differently than the previous 8. I'm not going to quantify what differently means because I don't think numbers are the right language for it. What I will say is that the people I was working alongside started to notice. Not loudly. The men and women in special operations units do not give compliments the way people do at dinner parties. What they give you is a different quality of silence. They stop explaining things to you that you already know. They turn to look at you when something unexpected happens in the field. They give you the particular respect of assumption. They assume you have already thought of the thing they are about to say. I had a colleague named Reyes, a warrant officer. One of the most gifted tacticians I have ever met, who started calling me the librarian in the first week. The way people say a nickname, that's meant to be a little dismissive. By the 3rd month, the same word, said the same way, meant something completely different. There was one mission. I'm going to tell you about it, because it is the one that matters to what comes later. But I am going to tell it plainly. We were 2 kilometers outside a target site when the intelligence we had been operating on turned out to be partially fabricated. The route we'd planned assumed a clear approach from the northeast. The approach was not clear. There were 2 options: abort entirely, or adapt in the next 4 minutes before our window closed. I had studied that area for 3 weeks. Not because anyone asked me to. Because it was the next area on my list and I worked in order, I laid out the alternate route. 7 steps. It took me 90 seconds to communicate it. It took the team 4 minutes to execute the first part. It worked. Afterward, Reyes sat next to me in the debrief and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Do you ever sleep?" I told him I slept fine. He shook his head slowly. "The guys are calling you something?" he said. I asked what. He looked at me sideways. "The quiet storm," he said. "As in, you show up calm. You show up prepared. And then things change." He paused. "I've been doing this for 11 years. I've worked with a lot of people. You're different." I wrote it in my notebook that night. Not because I was proud. Because I wanted to remember what it felt like to be seen accurately. I finished my deployment 14 months later, and came home with a commendation I hadn't expected and a way of moving through the world that was harder to articulate. Something had been confirmed that I had suspected for a long time, that the qualities everyone in my family had treated as weaknesses, the quietness, the lists, the patience, the refusal to perform confidence I didn't have, were not weaknesses at all. They were my entire method. They had kept people alive. I went home to visit my parents in October of that year. My mother had called and asked, careful and steady, as always. And I had said yes. My brother happened to be there for the weekend. I didn't know that until I pulled up to the house. My father was having a small gathering, a few of his army buddies, men he'd served with in his own time, now retired and comfortable and fond of talking about a world they'd known 30 years ago. I didn't know the full guest list until I walked into the backyard and saw the tables set up on the grass. I also didn't know that Derek had brought someone. My brother had recently started seeing a woman in his unit, a sergeant. Someone I'd never met. She seemed fine. Professionally, she had good posture and a firm handshake and the practiced ease of someone who was used to social situations, I shook her hand and said it was nice to meet her and moved toward my mother, who was near the drink table and who squeezed my arm and said nothing, and said everything. The gathering was fine for the first hour. My father was in a good mood, which made the whole atmosphere easier. Derek circulated, the way he always did. Comfortable. Receiving the attention of my father's friends, the way someone accepts a gift they expected. I sat near my mother and talked to one of my father's old colleagues about logistics, which is not a glamorous topic but is one I actually love. And the conversation was good. Then someone asked my brother to introduce his girlfriend to the group. He stood up, hand on her shoulder, all easy confidence, and gave a brief summary of her service. It was a good summary. She had done real work, real deployments, and he presented her with obvious pride. Then my father's oldest friend, a man named Colonel Hartley, retired, white-haired, the kind of retired officer who still held himself like the rank was tattooed on his spine, looked across the table at me. "And what about you?" he said. "Derek's sister. What have you been doing?" Before I could answer, my brother laughed. It was the same easy laugh. Not cruel on the surface. Just comfortable, the comfort of someone who has already decided the shape of the story. She was an advisor, Derek said. And the way he said advisor put small, invisible quotation marks around it. Support role. Attached to a spec ops unit, which sounds impressive. But he shrugged. You know how those roles work? You're not actually running the ops. You're in the background. The table was listening. 8 people, including 2 retired colonels, a retired CW4, my mother, my brother's girlfriend, and Colonel Hartley, who had not looked away from me. My brother's girlfriend was looking at me too. She'd gone very still. She's smart, Derek continued. And he said it fondly. The way you say it about someone whose intelligence you've categorized as harmless, book smart. It's a different thing. Right? Than actual field work? Colonel Hartley still hadn't moved. What unit? He said. His voice was different now. Not louder. Quieter. I told him. Something shifted in his face. Not dramatically. A small recalibration. The kind that happens when information reorders itself. What was your role? He said. I described it briefly. The intelligence analysis work, the pattern identification, the advisory function in the field. The table was very quiet. The northeast approach. Colonel Hartley said slowly. That mission, and he stopped himself. Conscious of the context, I received a briefing about an alternate routing decision that saved a team in that region. 14 months ago. He looked at me steadily. That was you, I said yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked down the table at a man I hadn't been formally introduced to, a man in his late 40s who had been mostly silent all evening. Who I now realized had the particular stillness of someone who was always listening and very rarely surprised. That man was looking at me with an expression I recognized because I had learned to read that expression over 14 months of working alongside people who only showed what they meant to show. He leaned forward slightly. Are you the quiet storm? He said. The backyard had gone completely silent. Even the ambient sounds seemed to stop for a moment. The ice in glasses, the distant traffic. All of it. I looked at him. That's what they called me, see? I said. He sat back slowly. He looked at my father. He looked at my brother. Then he looked at my mother, who was sitting with her hands folded on the table and her expression absolutely still and her eyes very bright. I worked with your daughter's unit as an advisor for 3 months last year, he said. He was speaking to my father, but he was not looking away from my mother. She identified an intelligence failure that 4 senior analysts had missed for 8 months. In the field, she made a routing call in 90 seconds that I would have been satisfied with if it had taken 90 minutes. He paused. I have been doing this work for 19 years. I don't say things like this unless I mean them. My brother had stopped smiling. My father was looking at me the way he had never looked at me. Not with pride. Exactly. With something that looked more like the first moments of understanding the expression of a person who has just realized that the map they've been using is wrong. My brother's girlfriend was looking at her hands. My mother's eyes were bright, and she did not look away from me, and she did not say a word. Colonel Hartley looked at me across the table. "You should be proud," he said. And he wasn't talking to my father. I didn't feel triumph. That's the honest thing. I had stopped wanting triumph from these particular people a long time ago, somewhere around the 9th month overseas. When I understood that the validation I had needed from my family had quietly been replaced by something else, by the knowledge of what I had actually done, by the memory of Reyes's face in the debrief, by the weight of having been seen accurately by people who only respected what they'd actually witnessed. But I will tell you what I did feel. I felt my mother's hand on mine under the table. She had reached across without looking, without making a scene, without announcing anything. Just her hand on mine. Steady. Warm. The same way she had said 4 words at a kitchen table 6 years ago. I held on to it. After the guests had gone, Derek found me in the kitchen. My mother had gone upstairs. My father was in the backyard by himself, which I understood was where he went when he needed to think. My brother stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. He looked younger than usual. He looked like the version of himself that existed before the confidence had fully calcified, slightly uncertain, slightly open. He said, "I didn't know." I told him that I understood. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I should have asked. I had this idea of you that I just kept using. I never actually asked." I looked at him for a moment. The honest thing was that I was not angry anymore. Anger requires proximity. And I had moved a long way from the version of myself who had needed him to see me. What I felt was something more like tiredness. And underneath the tiredness, something softer, the recognition that he was, at the end of it, just a person who had been given a story about his family and had never questioned it. I told him it was all right. He shook his head. "It's not. Really," he said. "But I'm glad it's you." The Quiet Storm. He almost smiled. "It's a good name." I told him the guys who gave it to me were good people. He nodded. He went back to the backyard. I stood in the kitchen for a while. The dishes were done. The lights were on. The house smelled like the same food it had always smelled like. And the table was the same table where I had sat for 20 years cutting my food into smaller pieces while my father talked about my brother. I went upstairs and knocked on my mother's door. She was sitting in the chair by the window. She looked up when I came in and didn't say anything. I sat on the edge of the bed, and we stayed there for a while. Quiet. The way we had always understood each other best. After a while she said, "I always knew." I told her I knew she did. She said, "I should have said it more." Out loud. In front of them. I told her the 4 words at the mailbox had been enough. She looked at me. "What 4 words?" I told her. "I think you can do it." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I still think so." I was 31 years old. Sitting on the edge of my mother's bed in the house where I had been invisible for most of my childhood. And I had just been recognized in a backyard by a man who had watched me work in conditions I am not allowed to fully describe. And my brother had stood in a kitchen doorway and said I didn't know. And my father was in the backyard by himself, trying to rearrange something, and the most important thing that had happened all day was my mother's hand under the table. The revenge I never planned was not the silence in the backyard. It was not Colonel Hartley's voice or the expression on my brother's face or my father looking at me like the map was wrong. It was the person my family had spent years not seeing had simply kept going. Had kept the lists. Had kept the patience. Had walked into rooms where no one expected anything of her and had done the work anyway. And the work had been real. And the people who needed it to be real had known that it was. I didn't need my father to toast me at dinner. I had already been somewhere,